Is it in the wheels? Is it in the stirrup? Is it in the pointing to the various parts of the chariot? Although a stirrup undoubtedly is not part of a chariot. But is it in any of one of these pieces? And clearly it's not. If you take all the pieces apart, there's no chariot to be found, and chariotness isn't in any one of the pieces. And so it's the concept of chariot is applied to a constellation of chariot parts, no one of which is a chariot. And so that this interdependent arising of any phenomenon, obviously this consideration can be pointed inward. So you look at anger, say, where is anger? Is anger that feeling of energy in your face? Is it the feeling in your chest? Is it the thought of the person you're angry at arising and passing away? No one of these things is anger, and yet anger is this name we give to a constellation of mental phenomenon.
I think there's a point here which might be worth illuminating, which is about the union of appearance and emptiness. And so the example that's often used, and like what is, and it's related to your example of the chariot, is that of a rainbow. After rain, the sun comes out and we see a rainbow, and it's really beautiful. There's often a nice, delighted feeling in us. But when we look more carefully, we see, is there anything which is a rainbow? And when we analyze it, in a careful way, we see there's no rainbow apart from, just as you mentioned with the chariot, there's water and air and light, and the conditions come together in a certain way. And so there's an appearance of a rainbow. So what's interesting is not to deny the level of appearance, right? The appearance is there and we experience it. And yet the rainbow is just a designation for an appearance. It's not a designation for something that is there in itself. And so that's another understanding of emptiness. Just in this regard, there was one little exchange with a Tibetan teacher when somebody asked him, is the self real? And his response was, yes, it's real, but it's not really real. You exaggerate it. And I love that, because on one level, the self is there's an appearance of a self, of Sam, Joseph, and everybody else. But when we look more carefully, it is just an appearance of conditions coming together. And so
in that case, that's a different self than the self I'm recommending and you're recommending that someone lose in the insight of anatta. I would say that's referring to the person. A person is like a chariot. You point to person parts. Or a human mind. The mind clearly exists. People clearly exist. And yet they're designated upon processes and parts that are, once you separate them, then there is in some paradoxical sense nothing defined. But the self that is an illusion that can be cut through, that's an illusion in a different sense. That is something that you can not find, and still all of the phenomenology of having a mind and being a person and being in a world with chariots and rainbows, all of that is still present, and yet the implied center in consciousness can drop away. So that's one point, that there's gradations to this illusion. Another thing I'd put in this category is free will. Free will is a misconceived notion about the way the world works. It's not like a chariot or a rainbow. It's actually not there. Right? The self is like that. The self that is the atta that anatta cancels is like that. That doesn't cancel the human mind, doesn't cancel the phenomenon of thoughts and emotions and bodily sensations. So that's the difference I'm pointing to.
I haven't quite understood what that comment was in reference to, because I totally agree with that.
It's the way we moved from the analogies of the chariot and the rainbow to the self, which I thought was potentially misleading.
Yeah, it could be misleading.
It applies to the person, it applies to the human mind. It doesn't apply, at least in my view, to the sense of there being a thinker of the thought.
Yes. Yeah. But I think it's just a way of acknowledging the conventional designation. That here we are, there's Sam sitting over there, and I'm sitting over here, and we're talking to one another. So in the conventional level.
That sort of self
Yeah.
exists.
Yeah.
But
And
the
so it's
self
just
as the person exists.
Yeah, so it's just acknowledging that, but the Buddha went much deeper to see that when you look carefully, it doesn't refer to anything in and of itself. It's just a collection of elements.
Right. Yeah. What's different about self, though, is that we seem to experience the self essence as being a center to consciousness and a thinker of thoughts.
Yes.
In a way that we don't impute a chariot or rainbow essence when we look closely at them.
Mm-hmm.
There's another connection to emptiness, though, that just occurs to me, which is the experience of selflessness does, when it's experienced clearly, does change one's experience of the outer world, so that there is an experience of what I would call emptiness when looking at the world that is the consequence of this centerlessness, which is the concepts one applies to the world are held much more loosely.
Until they're not.
First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then
No. Well, there's that.
You're giving me a Donovan song?
There's that, but it's also, just in the way you were saying it, it suggested that...
I'm reifying emptiness? Or
or that...
The false god of emptiness?
It becomes a steady state of that realization.
Right.
Whereas one can have a realization, a transforming one, of selflessness, and still many times still get caught up in identification with one thing or another. So.
Oh yeah. I thought you were making the deeper Zen point of no longer holding to emptiness. Yes.
That too. And just an interesting point here is, and it was made both by Nagarjuna and one of our, Dzogchen masters, Nyoshul Khenrin Rinpoche, in talking about different kinds of attachment, where it said that attachment to things being solid and real, in some substantial way, is very problematic. But even worse and more difficult to uproot is attachment to emptiness, because people can get some notion of emptiness and be continually up-leveling every conversation, even one's Dharma practice. Oh, everything is empty, nothing matters.
Yeah.
And they, both Nagarjuna and Nyoshul Khenrin Rinpoche, were saying, for people who are caught in that attachment, it's extremely difficult to come out of it, because there's no place to take a stand. But it's a conceptual place. Yeah. It's not a place of actual realization.
Well, that's what I think we touched on in the last podcast around some of the liabilities that we both saw in Punjaji's scene, which is, I guess, for which Vedanta as a tradition is also somewhat culpable. This emphasis on the all or nothing quality of the realization, and there is nothing to practice apart from just getting it, capital I, capital T. And if you've gotten it, there's no reason to practice, and if you feel there's a reason to practice, you haven't gotten it. Having the path articulated that steeply leaves a lot of people pretending to have gotten it, or having some experience and no conceptual understanding that they can then practice that experience. And so they're just left thinking about it and asserting it conceptually and becoming incredibly annoying. There's a related question here I'm seeing on Twitter, which is from Joseph K., Kafka's characters. Is ego loss one state, or are there varying kinds and degrees of ego loss? If the latter, elaborate on the different types. Is there only one insight into the illusoriness of the self?
I think this can be answered in several different ways. Two come to mind just at the moment. So in the classical Theravada model of defilements being uprooted, at the first stage of stream entry, first stage of awakening, one of the defilements that's uprooted is wrong view. So there is a deep enough and transformative enough realization of emptiness that the view of self, the view that there is some self-center to this whole process, that's uprooted. And so one's whole view of, this mind-body and the world really is transformed. What's interesting, though, is that there is another defilement of mind which is not uprooted until the last stage of awakening, until one is in Arhat, which is called the defilement of conceit. In Pali it's called mana. And conceit means that sense of I am. And we can experience this I am in two different ways. We can experience it over time. That is when we have the sense of I was, in whatever way we were in the past, I am this way now, I will be in the future.
So it's a more global self-concept, a narrative self, or the autobiographical self.
Yeah, and so that's one way it can be experienced. It can also be, this conceit of I am can also be experienced in terms of when we're comparing ourselves with others in one way or another, which we do a lot. That's a very common pattern. We see ourselves as better or worse, or in whatever way we're evaluating. More beautiful, less beautiful, smarter, not smarter. So that's another manifestation of I am. What's interesting is that this pattern is very deeply conditioned. It's still there even after the wrong view of self has been uprooted. We've had a realization that the view of self is incorrect and it really has been uprooted. But the habit pattern of the conceit is so deeply conditioned that the habit pattern continues. The difference is that even as we're caught in that habit pattern, the understanding is that the conceit itself is selfless. So we don't have the view that that pattern is self, even though the very pattern is constellating some sense of I am in that moment. So that's part of the gradation of the understanding. There's one other way of understanding the gradation, which I find really useful because it's exceedingly pragmatic. You know, we can talk about emptiness, we can talk about selflessness, and some people may resonate with it, some people it just feels too abstract, and you know, what's really being talked about here. In one way, the most pragmatic experience of self and selflessness really has to do with whether in any moment of experience there is an identification with that experience as being I or mine. So a thought comes. If we're identified with a thought, I'm thinking, or this is my thought, in that moment the notion of self is being created. It's not that the self is something that's there and has to be uprooted. It's simply a question of, do we stop creating it moment after moment through not identifying with what's arising? And I find this just really useful because then it becomes interesting to watch, okay, what are the things we most commonly identify with? What are the kind of thoughts? You know, many thoughts come and go. We're not identified with them. They're just like sounds passing through. But then certain thoughts we will be identified with, or certain emotions, you know, or certain situations in the bodies.
Not being identified with thought, at least in my lexicon, is synonymous with recognizing thoughts as thoughts. Now, that's
Yes.
already a high level of mindfulness practice
Yeah.
for someone to be able to do that with any kind of regularity. So were you saying that, or were you talking about thoughts that pass through an ordinary person's mind without much consequence, and yet they're still not recognizing?
Right. No, I'm talking about the first.
Okay.
And I would say it's true that it takes some degree of mindfulness, but to go back to your earlier point, I don't think it's a question, I'll use the M word, I don't think it's a question of momentum. I think, and here's going back to our earlier conversation, I think it's more a question of interest. If people are interested in watching their minds and understanding their minds, this is a capacity that we all have. It doesn't take any great meditative depth or skill. We just have to be interested in noticing thoughts, you know, as they come. And many we won't be mindful of, we'll be caught up in. But the more interested we are, we can see that. And notice the difference between being lost and identified with them and not. So I think there's great potential here for getting glimpses of selflessness in the midst of our ordinary lives.
I've seen many questions about Goenka's style of body scanning versus the Mahasi style of noting or just any other form of mindfulness. I think some of this could be inspired by the last podcast where you described your very unpleasant experience of striving in a goal-oriented way in the context of practicing under Goenka. So many people are wondering whether you feel that there's a better or worse version of mindfulness practice that you may want.
Not at all. I think that there are... Munindraji, my first teacher, he had a very open, curious mind. So he was very non-dogmatic, non-sectarian. After he did most of his practice with Mahasi Sayadaw in Burma, and then he went and he said he studied over 50 different ways of doing Vipassana in Burma. And he just had this tremendous interest. And I really appreciate kind of what I learned from him in terms of this non-sectarian attitude. And having practiced in a few of those different modes of Vipassana, I definitely do not see one as being better or worse than another. They're all skillful means at different times for different people. One or another may be more or less effective. And I've been as striving in the Mahasi method as in doing Goenka's method. I've been as striving doing Dzogchen as doing... And striving has nothing to do with the practice.
Then you were really doing it wrong, Joseph.
I was doing it wrong in all of them.
But really, to strive in Dzogchen, that is just... Of all the things to strive in.
Well, exactly. Well,
it's like injuring yourself eating frozen yogurt.
The same is true in Vipassana. If one is striving in that unskillful sense, it is not doing it correctly. But that is a pattern that is in us. There's that wanting in the mind, and we have to learn to see it in order to let go of it.
If you were striving in Dzogchen,
you can't let go of this.
I'm going to say that was the consequence of all your Vipassana training. You were trying
I don't think so.
You were trying to figure out how to Vipassanize it.
No, I think it's a liability of, and not a liability. I think it in a way it's part of the path for everybody. That when the Buddha was talking about the example of right effort and of really understanding what that means, he used the example of tuning the strings of a lute, too tight, too loose. It's only by watching the mind, in these various ways, that we see, that we come to the balance of non-striving.
Well, in defense of your striving in Dzogchen, there are all the other things that, or the other practices you get handed in Dzogchen beyond this insight into emptiness or non-duality. There's all of the visual stuff that gets emphasized later on. And
even aside from that, even in the Dzogchen practice itself, Sogni Rinpoche had a beautiful little piece, which I can't remember it in detail now. He was basically talking about the various levels of kind of attachment or striving in doing Dzogchen practice, as one is learning it. This is not after mastering it, but in the learning of it, the very natural tendency of the mind, maybe to get a glimpse of the empty nature of mind, and then wanting to sustain
to prolong it. Yeah.
So there are so many subtleties.
A good analogy that he uses for that very error is, it's like ringing a bell and then trying to prolong the natural continuity of the ring.
Yeah.
So you ring the bell, you ring it once, and then it lasts as long as it lasts.
Yeah.
You don't keep bashing the bell trying to.
Yeah.
So.
And it's just there are many. Each tradition has its own particular forms of, you could say, of doing it wrong. But that's all part of the learning. That's, if we could do it perfectly from the beginning, we'd all be enlightened masters. I guess I just want to, I'm not sure what this is in reference to, but it's just coming to mind in the moment. And in a way, for me, it ties together the Vipassana and the Dzogchen and kind of all the traditions. And for me, the practice has become so simple and integrated at this point. And it really revolves around the Four Noble Truths, but in a very pragmatic way, not in a theoretical way. And so when the Buddha talked about nibbana, or the free mind, as being the end of craving. And so he says this in many places. It's very explicit. There's the truth of dukkha, the truth of suffering, and the cause of that is, we talked about a little bit before, kind of the wanting mind is itself a state of suffering. And the end of dukkha is the end of craving. And for a long time, I would think of that as being the far-off goal. You know, okay, if I practice, for 20 years or 20 lifetimes, maybe at some point I'd reach the end of craving. But at one point on retreat, I had a kind of realization that we can actually practice the end of craving moment to moment. And then it becomes very interesting to watch in all the ways we discussed, the kind of the wrong ways of doing practice. Whatever the practice is, whether Vipassana or Dzogchen or different techniques of Vipassana, that basically the wrong ways of doing them involve some kind of craving or other. It's wanting something. And that the release from craving in the moment, the momentary letting go of that wanting, that craving, is a settling back, you could say,